you should never be shocked by your results, because everything that you currently are is a result of everything that you've been. And everything that you will be is a result of who you are today. How I like to say it is that, yes, today is a result of yesterday infinitely, right? Tomorrow will be a result of today infinitely, right? And so there is no magic.
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is James Purpura, who will share how we can live our ultimate life. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life, to wake up energized, excited about the day, to have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want, to be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. While you're there, you can sign up for a monthly email where I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. You can also listen to coaching calls under the Coaching Calls tab. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. And there's also a Facebook group where you can ask questions and interact with other listeners. Today's quote comes from Dan Gilbert. Part of us believes the new car is better because it lasts longer. But in fact, that's the worst thing about the new car. It will stay around to disappoint you. But a trip to Europe is over. It evaporates. It has the good sense to go away, and you're left with nothing but a wonderful memory. Isn't that interesting? I think it has to do with the fact that the car is going to give us an immediate spike, but then we adapt to it. It becomes our new normal, our expectation. The trips many times have a long ramp up to going, and then the experience itself while we're on the trip, and then reliving it once home. But it goes away. The other interesting thing is that buying the car creates jealousy from others, but taking the trip usually doesn't create that same emotional response in others. They want to celebrate in your trip. Bottom line, things are not what they seem, and that's our theme today in our interview. Last week's action step was to try the appreciation exercise. I'm spending a lot more time focused on gratitude every morning. I'm currently taking the course from Yale on the science of well-being, and there is scientific proof behind these theories. They are real. They work. The opening quote was something that came out of that course. The main theme is we are wrong about what we think will make us happy. And today, in our talk with James, we're going to go much deeper into that topic. James and Steph Purpura, when they first met, both of their lives were rock bottom financially, emotionally, and spiritually. The story of how they dedicated themselves to transforming their inner and outer experiences of life, creating a fortune, and an inspiring journey with practical lessons of self-transformation for anyone who has ever dreamed of becoming a better and more successful person. And so let's meet our guest. Welcome to Richer Soul, James Purpura. It's great to have you join us today.
Well, I'm super excited to be here.
And I'm excited for the conversation. I just got to watch the movie last night, and so it's fresh on my mind. But before we get to that, we always like to start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
Well, it's interesting because I have a lot of thoughts about money and what money means and, what it means to make money and how to make money. But, when I was growing up, I grew up so I had two different lives because my mom, was very broke, and my dad was always kind of hustling on the edge. Once he got his life straightened out, and was, always buying new cars and different things. And so one side, it was always scarcity. And then I would go to my dad's house and it'd be like Disneyland. Dad, he would spoil us and things like that. Now, that being said, my dad was also somebody who was constantly underplaying his success through the language of scarcity. There's never enough, doomsday is coming, and so throughout my entire childhood, I was taught to be a victim with a very scarcity mindset.
And that's interesting that you're also so aware of it as well. Not everyone is totally aware of labeling it in such a way that you have.
Well, because that's really what my work is about, right? Essentially, what I'm trying to demonstrate to people. So our movie and our book is called Perception, Seeing is Not Believing. I think that people think that, they hear their whole lives, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, actually, the opposite is true, but we can get into that later. But, essentially, we open up the movie with my childhood story. And so I was in my kindergarten class, and my teacher, the first day I was going to go to special ed, called me up in front of the room, right? And she told me that only stupid and retarded kids go to special ed. And then she made all the kids call me stupid and retarded when I went out the door. And how that relates to what we're talking about is because when I got home that night, I went home and I told my mom. And my mom was an undiagnosed bipolar manic depressive, and she really didn't have the capacity to handle a problem of this magnitude. And so here's what my mom told me, and this really comes down to everything that we're talking about today. She said, the world's a cool place. People are mean, right? You're just going to have to learn to deal with this. And so it was that thought or idea, along with the other ones that I chose to believe about myself through living through that other experience, that really formed and changed my life, right? Because it was like, I had this underlying theme. My mom had a victim mentality, but on anything you can ever imagine, right? And it really was, the world's out to get you, and that sort of thing. And that's literally what caused a life full of trauma for me, were those thoughts and beliefs that I adopted in those early moments.
And we've talked about that a lot. It's what happens in childhood that we hold on to all the way to adulthood, and it no longer serves us. And until we're aware of those things and we can call them out and change them, we're essentially living as a little kid in an adult body, even though we don't want to admit that or notice that. I'm just curious, why was the teacher so mean to you? Like, what was wrong with her?
So, the only explanation I have about that, Rocky, is hurt people, right? You can only imagine what kind of trauma she had been through to put a 5-year-old kid through that. And so the one thing I do know about myself when I was that age, I was one of those kids who lit up the room, full of energy and life, and, everything was just magical, and I was full of wonder and awe. And I think that she saw that in me. And I think that people who have experienced a lot of trauma and their light has been put out, when somebody shines their light as bright as I did before that point, I think they attack it because they're scared of it. I kind of liken it to, imagine you're laying in a dark room and somebody flips the light on. What do? It's not like you're like, oh, good, the light. If a bright light comes on, you hide, you shield your eyes, right? You try to get it off, like turn that off. And, that's the only thing I know, because I didn't follow the teacher. I mean, when you're 5, everybody looks old, right? So I had no idea how old she was. I don't know if she's alive. I don't know if she's dead. And I got to be honest with you. I mean, I do know her name, but I don't really care to know her story because it doesn't matter.
And that's true. I guess the bigger thing is if you can forgive and let go, which I'm sure you've done.
So, yes, but not in the way that you might think. So the world's idea of forgiveness doesn't really resonate with me, right? Because, I grew up in a very religious household, right? And so, I would go to church every Sunday and I'd hear forgive, forgive, forgive. And then I would hear things like, if you're a good person, you do good things, you'll have a good life. But that wasn't my experience. I was a great person. And it seemed like the world was always crapping on me. And so it's like, why can those two things not coexist? And so essentially, a big part of our story is that, what I was trying to demonstrate through telling this movie is I have this childhood experience, right? And that, that experience and the things I chose to believe about myself through living through those experiences set the tone for the rest of my life. And so I ended up in a jail cell eventually. Matter of fact, it was solitary confinement. And one day I was pondering the very thing that you just said is like forgiveness, right? And so I used to write these really long lists of people who had harmed me. And one day I looked down at this list and I thought to myself, I used to do it because what I would do is I'd go in and I would pray. And then I would meditate and I would try to offer these people forgiveness in the form of forgiveness that I understood through my upbringing. But it didn't seem to be resonating with me because, the concept of forgiveness in traditional terms always has blame associated with it, right? And one day I was writing this list of people who felt like it harmed me, and I looked down and I had this thought. The only common denominator between all these situations is me. What if I somehow created all of this? And, I'd never really, that was the first time I'd ever had the thought that I may be the creator of my experience. And so I really went into what that meant. And where I got to was kind of like this. It was like, well, I couldn't created some of it and not all of it. So either I created all of it or none of it, right? I can't be partial creator. And so I thought what it meant if I didn't create my existence. And if I didn't create my existence because I had a terrible life to that point, it meant the world really was a terrible place, and I probably didn't want to play anymore. And the second thing I said, well, what if I did create my experiences? And then I thought, well, then I'd have to take responsibility for everything that ever happened to me. And it's just this idea of ownership. And so when I think about ownership and when I say take responsibility, people always go, wait, are you saying you're taking responsibility for the abuse? And say, just hold on a second, because let me tell the rest of the story. And here's where it comes down to is after I decided that I was, in fact, the creator of my experience because the other option didn't seem appealing to me, I had to decide what it was that created my experience. So the next question I asked myself was, did my abuse define me? Did it create my experience? And here's where I got to, Rocky. If my abuse defined me, it meant that I was stuck forever because I couldn't go back and change the abuse. And then I had asked myself another question, which was, well, has everybody who's ever incurred abuse allowed it to destroy them? And the answer is no, so it couldn't have been the abuse. And so what I decided after thinking about it a long period of time was it wasn't the abuse that created my terrible life. It was what I chose to believe about myself having lived through that abuse and having that interaction with my mom. It was my beliefs that almost destroyed me. It wasn't the abuse, which, I tell that story. People are like, don't do that. Don't blame yourself. And I'm like, stop taking my power away, because what you don't understand is if it was my choice, I can always go back and choose to believe something different about myself. I can never go back and change the abuse. So from that point forward, forgiveness became about forgiving myself for choosing to believe things that destroyed my experiences. And then I just leave the other part to the other person, right? Their part has nothing to do with me. And so essentially, I think that forgiveness is never about letting the other person off the hook. It's about letting yourself off the hook.
And it's true. I remember a story of two monks, and it's an old fable, and they come to the river, and there's a woman there, and they have to go across the river. And the one monk, who's not allowed to, actually picks up the woman and takes her across the river. And then they go about their day. Well, the other monk is fuming the whole day. And at the end of the day, he's like, you picked up that woman, you carried her across the water. We're not allowed to do that. And the older monk looked at him and said, I let go of that woman hours ago. You're still carrying her. And that essentially is what it is in this case, right? Do we let go of what happened? The abuse stopped years ago. Are we still carrying it? And whatever it is, we each have our own stories and our own challenges and the things that we've experienced. Do we continue to carry things for 20, 30, 40 years, or do we let go of them? And
well, the answer is we do continue to carry things, right? I mean, but you're exactly right, because, my wife and I were talking one day, and she looked at me and goes, our abusers have long since forgotten, right? They don't think about that abuse. The hate that you hold towards them, does not impact them. It only impacts you, right? And that's the point, is that it's what you choose to take away from any situation. And look, I know that people are angry because of the situations they incurred in their childhood, and they have a right to be angry, right? Your anger is fully justified. The question is, does it serve you? And that's where the conversation really switches and changes. Just because you have a right to be angry, have you ever stopped and thought, does holding on to this anger, resentment, serve me? And the answer is it does serve you, but it serves a very negative purpose in your life.
And that it does. So how do we overcome ourselves?
Well, here's what's interesting, because you brought something up, and I actually wrote a section in our book about it, right? And so I ask people this all the time. Let me ask you a question, Rocky. If you had a really important decision to make, would you hand it over to a 5 or 6 year old to make for you?
Never.
Never, right? And that's what everybody says, never. And so here's what people don't understand is there are two principles that dictate everything that your life is. And those two principles are perception and emotions. Perception gives, your life, everything you are, everything you experience is dictated by perceptions, and your emotions give your life the only meaning they have. Now, here's what's amazing about that statement is that's a true statement. It's scientifically true. But few of us understand those things fully. So we don't understand the mechanism that's dictating our lives. So let me tell you what happens when you have an experience, because this is where we get messed up, is people think that they see reality. Why? Because it feels real. But in reality, you don't have any access to reality. You only see what you think reality is based on what it was in the past. So every time you're having an experience, right, then that experience, what your mind does is something similar to a Google search. It goes back to the experience or set of experiences that's most like the experience you're having now, right? And it pulls the meaning from that experience and interprets what's going to happen next based on that. Oh, I know what this means, because it meant something to you in the past. But here's the part you don't have any insights into, is because your perception works on an unconscious or subconscious level, you don't know how far into your past your mind has to go to get the information it needs to dictate the current experience. You also don't know what emotions might be tied to that experience. So oftentimes, it's like something happens and we're really angry, and the amount of anger that we have doesn't seem to make sense for the situation we're currently in. And it's like, why am I so angry? And it's because the similar situation in the past made you angry. But I ask people all the time, it's a really simple question. It's like, would you like to have better self-esteem? They're like, of course. And I'm like, well, I think we can all agree with that, right? And I'm like, why? And they're like, well, it would impact everything. I would be more confident. I would be, I would show up differently. It would like impact every aspect of my life. And I'm like, I think we can all agree with that statement. The question is that self-esteem is just your opinion of yourself. If it would have such a big impact, why don't you change your opinion of yourself? And we all know it's not that easy. Now, here's where we get back is the experts say that your self-esteem is established by the age of 6 years old. And so when I asked you if you would hand your decision off to a 5 or 6 year old, and people go, no, that's ridiculous. The most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But in reality, that's what you're doing. Because if your self-esteem was established by the age of 5 or 6 years old, that means, and it would impact every decision you make, how you show up in every situation, that the 5 or 6 year old version of you actually has a big say in how your life is going to turn out. And that is just scary, because I don't know what you were doing at 5 or 6, but, for me, it was like spit wads and, I didn't have a good view of the world. And that's the problem we're facing right here, Rocky. And the answer to your question is like, there's a lot of tools how that I can teach people. But the first thing we have to do is open up the willingness to do the work. And so why don't we have a willingness to look at those old beliefs, behaviors, and ideas, because we don't think they're really impacting us right now. But that statement couldn't be further from the truth. Is everything that's happened to you, prior to this moment is impacting what's currently going on. And those things that were traumatic, that have unprocessed emotions with them, are impacting them to a much greater level. So the first thing you have to do is have a moment of clarity where you look and go, wait, I can change this. I should change this because it has massive impact on my life today.
And I know in today's world, everyone is running around so much, so it's hard to get clarity on what we want. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. And part of it is because maybe they followed a path somebody else told them, or they just never spent the time to think about it. And when we're in school, we're never taught, hey, this is how you get clarity. We're taught, just follow this track and life will be great. How do people begin the process, and what are the steps to get clarity?
So that's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked it, Rocky, because I'm going to tell you the second underlying principle around perception is this. What you see and experience on the outside is a reflection of what you feel and believe on the inside. And now people go, well, that doesn't make sense to me because, I've got a manifestation mindset around money and I'm driving a Hyundai. So the caveat to my statement was what you see and experience on the outside is based on what you believe and feel on the inside in your subconscious and unconscious mind. And there's massive contradiction between what you think you believe in your conscious mind and what's actually going on in your subconscious and unconscious mind. And, so the question is that, well, how do you get clarity? What you have to understand is that if you think about, there's a lot of video game players, right? It's like, if you think about a video game, what are you doing? You're interacting in a virtual world. Well, what's basically happening is your beliefs, right, are being projected on the screen of the world, and that's what you're interacting with. So the reason everybody's running around like chickens with their head cut off is because they think they can enact change on the outside. So we're all running around trying to fix things. But in reality, you're trying to fix things at the level of effect, right? It's like going into a movie and thinking you can go up and slap the screen to change what's playing on the projector. If you want to change what's playing on the projector, you have to go to the projector, which is your source. And our projector is our beliefs and feelings. And so if you want to see something different on the outside, you have to change what you're feeling and believing on the inside. I think it was, a guy wrote in a book, it was Wayne Dyer, that said, when you change the way you look at things, you look at change, right? And that is life, because they think that they can enact change on the outside, but clarity comes from looking on the inside. And so I don't have to guess, Rocky. I don't have to guess. I could sit down with you and I could have a talk, and I could tell you what, in a very short period of time, what you believe about everything in your subconscious mind. And the question is how? Because the evidence is everywhere. Your life is a reflection of what you believe in your subconscious and unconscious mind. So if you want to know what you believe, look at your life. I can have a conversation about money with you, and I can tell you what your beliefs are about money. I can have a conversation about your relationships and tell you what your beliefs are about your relationships. We can have a conversation about your health, your fitness, right? Your interactions. And all of those things are congruent with what's going on. And it can't be any other way. And so clarity comes from understanding that the problems that you're incurring do not exist outside of you.
They don't. It's all within us. And I always say, if you show me somebody's checkbook and their calendar, I'll show you what they believe. So what do we deal with when people say, I want to be X, but then they're Y? So going back to your thing, I want to be rich and drive a nice car, but they're driving a Hyundai. How do they figure out what that, because they're believing, right? Their perception is one thing, their reality is another. So how do they change their perception to what they want their reality to be?
The first step is realizing that you're wrong. Well, what am I wrong about? Just about everything. Right? As it turns out. And that's the best news ever. Well, why is that good news? Because change only ever starts with a question. If you're right all the time, then your current life is the best it's ever going to get. Right? And so I have this conversation with people all the time. I have a manifestation mindset. And I'm like, you couldn't. Why not? Because you're broke. Right? And it's like, well, no, it's just not working. And I'm like, it can't be any other way. Right? And it's like, well, what do you mean? So I've got a really interesting conversation. I've never shared this story on a podcast before, but because your podcast is about money, I will share it with you. So I was having dinner with a friend. And so this friend of mine, he always wanted to make $125,000 a year. That was like, I had that same goal at one point too, where it's like, I just want to make $125,000 a year. And I think most people think, yeah, that's pretty good, right? So I hadn't seen him, I don't know, in 6 months or something, right? And he'd been making around $50,000 a year. And I see him and we sit down for dinner and he goes, hey, James, I did it. I make $125,000 a year now, right? And I'm like, oh my God, that's incredible. I said, you must have changed your feeling of worth. You must have changed how you feel on the inside. You must be in alignment with that. And you know what he said? He said, no, it feels like a lie. And I looked across the table at him and I said, if that lie doesn't become true, you're going to lose that money. Because every once in a while, we will have success without shifting, whether it's luck, whether you believe in God and God's fronting you the money to see if you'll grow into it, whether it's the universe. It doesn't really matter what you believe. The idea is that sometimes things get out of alignment, good or bad, right? And the question is, they will always move out to alignment. So if you are currently making more money than you feel like you deserve, don't worry, it's going to go away shortly. And so I told him that, and this guy's been in this space for a long time, and his eyes got giant, and he immediately realized what I was saying is true. Now, this is Saturday night. Monday morning, he goes into work. Monday morning, I'm not lying to you. His boss sits them down and says, somebody complained about your job. I am dropping your salary to $55,000 a year. Monday morning, right? And so he calls me freaking out. He's like, what do I do? And I said, well, it had to happen. He goes, I don't even, he's like, I get it. Like, well, why did it have to happen? I said, because you weren't You didn't believe that you deserved what you had, so therefore it was going to go away. And so he goes, well, shit, now I got to get another job. I said, no, that's the worst thing you can do. And it would be the same thing in a relationship, right? And he's like, why? And I said, because you might as well fix it where you're at before you take that and experience what you just experienced all over again, right? And he goes, well, what do you mean? I said, start changing your interpretation of what you think you deserve. Because the guy's smart, he's talented, he's worth, from my opinion, he's worth that money and more. But in his own opinion, he wasn't worth that. So immediately he's like, okay, what do I need to do? So we went into changing his internal dialogue, changing and shifting what he believed about himself. And it took him about 3 months, but he literally worked his way up to $125,000 again. And he was in complete alignment and congruence with that number at that point in time. So as soon as he got there, he quit that damn job and got one paid $135,000 because he was, because he didn't want to be there anymore after that experience because it was embarrassing for him. But he stayed in it. And I tell people this in relationships. It's like, oh, I just can't do it anymore. I'm like, it's you. It's not the other person. Until you fix you might as well fix it in the broken relationship, fix yourself in the broken relationship before you go find another broken relationship. And so I think that story really articulates what's going on here is that, what you see and experience on the outside is what you feel and believe on the inside. And if that gets out of alignment, it will always reset. And that is why change is so hard, because we're not focusing on changing on the inside, we're focusing on changing on the outside. So we white knuckle it. And it's like losing weight's a perfect example because it's so easy to track, right? And I was obsessed by this question because I had lost like 40 pounds like 7 times in 9 years. I'm like, why does it keep resetting? And here's why. Because I was changing at the level of effect. In other words, I was changing at the level of habits. So I'd go out, I'd start eating better and I'd exercise, but I'm white knuckling it because I don't change the belief underneath. And so my belief is drawing me one way and I'm going to overpower it and go another way, right? And so I get there and I lose the weight. And I'm like, I feel proud of myself. What do? I take my conscious attention off that. And I'm like, well, this is gone. And then I move it to maybe I'll, build my business more or put that energy somewhere else. And as soon as I do, if you don't change the belief that's underneath, that's driving your behavior, then the belief comes in and resets the behavior as soon as you take your conscious attention off of it.
And that's very true. We definitely need to do that. Today's episode is sponsored by Profit Answer Man Podcast. Did you know that most small business owners hate looking at their financials? It's one reason they may struggle with business success. The Profit Answer Man podcast helps them ensure they are profitable and can pay their employees and weather the storms we all have to face. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Profit Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform. One of the things I've heard is that as people grow and as they go up the income ladder and they get better and better opportunities, they're constantly struggling with imposter syndrome, no matter what level they're at. How does that kind of fit in with what you're talking about? Because if we do get success, sometimes we still don't feel like we deserve it, or sometimes it feels like it was too easy to get success. How do we bring that into congruence then?
So if you're dealing with imposter syndrome, you better figure it out quick, right? Is what I would tell you, right? And so here's the thing that people have to understand, right? Is that success was always about being. It was never about doing, right? And so, people get confused by that, but it's like, how do you become successful? You become that person. And so when you think about where you are in comparison to where you want to go, right? And it's like, okay, what we get caught up in is what are the steps I need to do in order to get there, right? And the question is not what do I need to do, it's who do I need to become, right? It's like, oh, when I get there and I have all this money or success, I will be this person. It doesn't work that way, right? The fastest way to get there is become that person. You know, how does that person act? What do they do? What do they feel inside? What's their level of confidence, right? Like, adopt those beliefs, you know, and, you know, I think it was Jim Rohn or somebody early on, I heard him say that when you get paid for what you do, you make a living. When you get paid for who you are, you make a fortune, right? And so, you know, at the highest point in my career, and I don't work for anybody else anymore, you know, I think my compensation package was around $1 million a year, right? And it was like, that's my value. And that value, I can take that value anywhere. I would never accept a role. I wouldn't accept a role anyway, but I'd never accept a role for less than that because that is my value. And that's how much value I bring to an organization because that's what I'm worth. That's who I am, right? And when you feel like you're an imposter, that's it, is that you don't feel like you belong there. And so let's talk about change for 1 second because this is really interesting. Just how hard is it to change, right? And so the statistics on change are alarming. 90% of people who start out to change any area of their life fail. 90%. That's a mind-blowing statistic, but that's not even the most scary one. 70% of the 10% that did succeed, so out of the 90, you have 10 people left, 70% of those give it all back after they accomplish their goal. And that's imposter syndrome. 70%. And this just doesn't have to do with weight. It has to do with money. It has to do with this. And that's what happens is now here's why that happens. Is because, and I'm going to go back to this for a second, but people think change is about changing the behaviors or the habits or doing the work, right, on the outside, when in fact change is about doing the work on the inside. If you focus all of your attention on the outside, right, then the rate of change is 3%. You know, when you take the 70 divided by the, you know, it's 3 people out of 100 actually accomplish change, right, actually reach their goals and sustain it. And the question is why? And the answer is this, because the 3% of people were able to change the beliefs unbeknownst to them as a part of moving towards their goal or idea. And so it's like what you just described. It's like, okay, well, I get a little bit more money, right? And I feel a little better about myself. And so I'm growing as I'm changing the habits. Or, you know, I'm working out and I look in the mirror and I feel better about myself. And I'm slowly changing my self-esteem as I change my habits. But that only happens 3% of the time. So the question is how do you change what's on the inside? And we've got some very specific methodologies about it, but literally what you have to do is you have to come to a fundamental understanding of perception of emotions. And here's the underlying principle around emotions. And this is really important, is most people are constantly making their emotions about other people and other people's emotions about them, which means that they're constantly saying, you made me mad, right? Or they're saying, you know, oh, they're mad at me, so they must not like me. And here's the issue, and this is where change comes in, is that here's what you need to understand, is that your emotions were never there to tell you there's something wrong on the outside. They were there to tell you there's something wrong on the inside. And so your emotions are your window into your subconscious mind. When you have a negative emotional reaction to something, it means there's a contradiction between what you think you have in your conscious mind and what's in your subconscious or unconscious mind. And that emotion is pointing to that contradiction, right? Because it's like, you know, coming out of my childhood, when I came out of that classroom, I thought I was stupid. So you could just about call me anything, Rocky, but if you called me stupid, it was on. I was angry. And so why? Because I knew in my conscious mind, I had a belief that I was smart, but in my subconscious mind was full of these ideas of being stupid and not good enough and everything else. And so you have to ask yourself this question: why do the things that upset me? And because they're pointing to the contradictions between what you think you believe and you actually believe. And just so people understand that 95% of your mental cognition is in your subconscious and unconscious mind. So the minority of what you think and feel about yourself is in your conscious mind. The window we have to look into those things is not only, reverse engineering our lives. Well, I must feel pretty terrible about money because I don't have any, but it's our emotions. When you learn to monitor and understand your emotions, they will give you all the feedback, their feedback mechanism for what you currently believe about yourself and the world around you.
And I think that's important. I know, and we talked about this before the call, and I talk about it with the compound curve for interest. And the compound curve works for everything, which I think what happens a lot of times is people don't realize when they wait to do something, they're not losing the beginning part of the curve. They're losing the massive end part of the curve where life is amazing and great. And, your money is multiplied so much. I know you mentioned that at the beginning. People don't calculate the cost of not changing. And that's probably one of the things that prevents people from doing the work because they don't realize how much they're giving up. What's been your experience with that?
So it's exactly that. It's like people don't calculate the cost of not changing. And so here's what people don't seem to realize. There is a cost without changing actions, because here's what you need. It's like, well, where I'm at is fine. Where you're at might be fine, but if you don't calculate the trajectory of your current path and where it's going to end up, you're probably going to end up somewhere you don't want to be, period. And so, look, guys, it's not magic, right? This is simple math. Let's take, weight, for instance. Do you weigh more or less than this time last year, right? Well, I weigh 10 pounds more, right? So if nothing changes, you will probably weigh 10 to 15 pounds more, right? Next year at this time. There's just no magic. You are on a path to somewhere. You have to calculate what that looks like. It's like, well, finances. Do you have more money or less money than you did this time last year? Are you in more debt or less debt? Well, if nothing changes, push that number out into the future. And that's where you're going to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? It's the same thing with your relationships. Are they better or worse than they were, right? Well, and so people believe in the act of God type of change. And that's never going to happen. Massive change is the result of small actions over a long period of time. Period. And then, like you said, with the curve, it's like at some point it hits this exponential curve, right? It's like, it's like when you're losing weight and you're moving towards something, it's like, once you get to a certain level of muscle mass, right, that muscle starts eating and things start progressing much, much faster. And so people like to think they're in ignorance. Here's what blows my mind, Rocky. And this is the part that just blows my mind. It's like people are shocked by their results, right? They're just shocked. Oh God, why did this have to happen to me? Why me? Why me? Why me? And it's like, I see people that have, heart disease or heart attacks and different things. Like, well, you ate massive amounts of food and you smoked cigarettes and you did this for 30 years. What did you think the results of that was going to be? Did you think that, and I don't mean to be insensitive because that's not my point here, is that you should never be shocked by your results, because everything that you currently are is a result of everything that you've been, and everything that you will be is a result of who you are today. And how I like to say it is that, yes, today is a result of yesterday infinitely, right? Tomorrow will be a result of today infinitely, right? And so there is no magic. I used to install cable and it was like, there's no magic in cable. That's the first thing they told me. I'm like, well, what does that mean? You either have a connection or you don't, right? It's like either, there's a connection. There is no magic in life, right? Either you're doing the things that move your life forward or you're not. And if you're not, take a look. If I continue my current path, where will I be 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And then either get okay with that or do the things that you need to do to change. You know, I've got this saying, and here's the saying. The saying is that, you know, either do the work to achieve your goals or change your goal. Because if you don't, then you're in suffering. Because every time you have a goal and you don't live in alignment with that, you know, you start, you know, it's like I have a goal of losing weight, and in the morning I pick up a donut and I'm like, well, maybe tomorrow. And then I beat myself up all day. So either do the work or change your goal. There's no shame in it. Either way, you just don't want to suffer. So you have to learn how to be honest with yourself.
And we have to be honest with the person in the mirror. That's just the reality of what it is. You've been extremely open about your childhood. I would call it vulnerable. I think a lot of people consider it a weakness to be vulnerable, to tell their story. What have you found by sharing your story?
You know what? Here's what's interesting, right? Is what you said is exactly true. Like I can't be vulnerable because I don't want to be weak. But every time somebody displays vulnerability, we're like, oh, that person is so strong. Right? We're like, wait, I could never do that, right? Because I have this belief. And so, you know, when my wife and I filmed our stories, you know, I remember her going to her and she's like, she had this belief that vulnerability was weakness, but she expressed exactly what I said. It's like, well, every time I see somebody doing it, I think it's strength. Now, it's interesting because here's the part of the story that nobody knows, right? So we shot the movie and we wrote our book. And before the movie came out, we had to sit down and tell our teenage kids all this bad stuff about us. And people were like, what? They didn't know? And the answer is no, they didn't know. And it's not because, maybe I was embarrassed of it, right? But it's not because of that. It's because here's one thing, and this goes back to your question earlier, right? It was like, what did you say? How did you disconnect? How do you change the narrative? And so I don't know if you know who Jordan Peterson is, but he's got this narrative. You have to stop saying things that make you weak. And so him and I had the same experience because he explains my experience to a T. One day, it was just after I got out of jail, and I was telling my victim's story, right? I've been in jail, and I've been abused, and I've been this, I've been that. And so one day, and I was the guy, like, it didn't matter how bad of a story you had, I'm going to top you, right? And it was like, anytime somebody gave me the opportunity to get on my soapbox, I would jump on it with both feet and I'd start telling my story. And so one day somebody gave me the opportunity. It was like, I had this little voice in my head say, it was like, you can tell the story, but it's going to cost you. I was like, wait, what? You can tell the story, but it's going to cost you. And so what I discovered on that day is I had to stop saying things that made me weak. Now, turns out at that point, I had to stop saying just about everything for a while because my entire self-narrative was reinforcing these old negative beliefs. And it would be so bad sometimes that I would want to tell this story so bad. Sometimes I would bite my inner lip. And so I had to disconnect. And so from the old version of me, and so what has changed? I mean, you think about it, my friend Bo Lotto says is that you can't go from A to B, right? So you have to start from going from A to not A, right? So what is not A in this scenario? And then you can go from not A to B. You have to stop identifying with A in order to become B, period. You cannot adopt a new belief until you're willing to disconnect from the old belief. So you can't go from, I believe that I'm stupid, I believe I'm smart. I have to stop believing that I'm stupid first. That's not A, right? And that's the challenge. And part of that is disconnecting from the parts of you that make you weak, that tell the story. And so the reason my kids didn't know is because from that day forward, I never told the story again until we did the movie. And the reason we did it is because we wanted to show people that no matter how down and out you are, that there's hope. Now, here's the long answer to your question is, so we actually filmed our stories and we showed them at a big event. We had 2,500 people there. And at the event, as the videos were playing, in between speakers to kind of tie all the content together. My wife was crying in the back going, oh my God, they're going to hate me. They're going to hate me. Because it was just like, she's pouring out her heart to complete strangers. After the event, this will blow your mind. We stood in line. People stood in line for 7 hours to meet us. And they all said the same thing. Thank you for telling my story. And thank you for giving me permission to tell my story. Because here's what people don't realize, is your story only has power over you when you hold it inside.
So I'm going to give everyone permission to tell their story. So if you think you don't have permission, you've just been given permission. Go tell your story. It will lighten you in a sense.
Not only will it lighten you, it will lighten the person that you tell it to, because you will give them permission unconsciously to tell their story.
And that's important. I think, and you mentioned this earlier, too often people think that there's a magic bullet. There's not. It's teeny little steps, step by step, and just constantly showing up and constantly making little changes over life. And that's where we end up. We've kind of danced around the subject. We haven't directly hit it, though. So I'll ask you, does money equal happiness for you?
So the answer is shockingly no. And it was very crushing and disappointing to figure that out, because I was absolutely sure that it would. So we tell the story as, when we got our first, from the time I left my jail cell to my first $1 million was 9 years. And from that point in time, so what happened was when we got our first $1 million, I looked at my wife and I said, are you happy? She said, no. I said, me either. And so we thought, well, I guess we just need more. So we went to 2 and we continued the discussion, right? And then what happened is that at that point, we decided that it wasn't true. And so I started actually doing a little bit of research on this. And there is one statistic, because I tell people this all the time. Money doesn't equal happiness. And they're like, that's just something that rich people say to make poor people feel better, right, about their situation. And that's actually not true. Essentially, what happens is that people fail to realize is that there is a statistic that supports this in a big way, which is that there was a 10-year study done on suicide. And the only common denominator is that rich people kill themselves more often than poor people. And people were shocked when they hear that. And I said, it makes perfect sense to me. They're like, why? And I said, because what if you put all of your hopes of happiness on this idea or concept of having money, and when you got to the end of that journey, what you were moving towards wasn't in fact there? You would be crushed. And what I say is that poor people no longer live with the illusion that money, creates happiness. I mean, rich people no longer live with the illusion that money, creates happiness, where poor people still have that out there. Like, well, if I can get here, then I will be happy. But the truth is you won't. And so we stopped and we turned around and we tried to figure out, well, what is it that creates happiness? And here's what we discovered, is that it happens, creating money and creating wealth. Creating money and creating happiness are not the same things, right? And what it takes to create one is not what it takes to create the other. And here's where it's scary in society, is that we've been made to choose, right? It's like, what are we made to choose before? It's like, oh, well, we can choose happiness and well-being, or we can choose money. And so what we have now is an environment where a bunch of rich people are miserable and a bunch of spiritual people who chase the well-being are happy, but they're sick and broke all the time. And so the question is, can we have both? And the answer is yes, once you understand the principles that dictate that. And so it turns out that what it takes to create money and what it takes to create happiness are not the same things, but they're actually different sides to the same coin that we call perception. Creating money and wealth is about shifting your perception of the outside world. So what things mean, what concepts, how do I look at things? Creating happiness is all about shifting your perception of the inside world and processing the emotions that are still stuck in your past traumatic events. And so that's what creates happiness.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. It's a journey and it's a process, and we kind of have to work through it and continue to show up.
Well, I think what you said is interesting. So here's why I'm talking to you today. And I want your listeners to understand this. It is a journey. It is a process. We do have to work through it. But when I started, I didn't have any information. My wife and I would sit on the bed every night. We would talk about ideas and concepts and beliefs and, issues and things like that. And we did that for years and years and years and years, where everybody else was partying, everybody else was hanging out. That's what we were doing. And so the entire reason that I'm talking to you today, and everybody who's listening to the sound of my voice, is because it doesn't have to be as difficult as it was for my wife and I. Because once you understand the principles that dictate your experience, then you can hone those principles and use them, and it can be a much easier journey, because we started at zero in every way, shape, and form, zero information, zero everything. Once you understand perception and emotions, then you can supercharge your experience, so you don't have to learn through blood, sweat, and tears. And that's why we made the book. That's why we wrote the book. That's why we made the movie, so that people could understand the concepts and ideas. It took us 15, 17 years to fully understand and grasp. And we put all those into the book. When people read our book, they're like, this is literally the handbook for life. Like, how come nobody ever shared this information with us before now?
And our schools aren't designed to teach us to be happy. They aren't designed to teach us success. They don't even teach us money. So it's funny, they teach us neither side of this issue of how do you become rich and happy and live an amazing life, which is a shame. Just out of curiosity, what did you do to set your kids on that path? Well,
it's interesting. So I think that there's a couple of principles that I really want my kids to understand, right? The first one is ownership and responsibility, right? So there's, in our book, we break down the three principles that really dictate success on the outside, right? And so why don't schools teach us stuff? Because schools are actually teaching people to produce things, right? Legal documents, medical, truck drivers. They're not teaching people how to be successful or happy or any of that. They're just, because of the way our society evolved, it's like, well, we have all these jobs to fill. It's a training school for, various types of jobs. It doesn't teach you how to think. And that's where things get scary, is that what I want my kids to do is be able to think independently. Because here's the key, guys, is that what you need to understand is life was never, ever about finding answers. It was only ever about asking the right questions. And that's where we get into trouble, right? Is because not only do most people not know how to ask the right questions, they don't even know what a good question is, right? And so it's your ability to question everything that's going to dictate how your life is going to turn out. And here's where we get in the trap, is that, we evolved as a species to survival is our main thing. And so all of our mechanisms inside of us are moving towards survival all the time. But what is survival? Survival can be summed up in one word. It's certainty. If you're in certainty, you're going to survive. If you're in uncertainty, you're not going to survive. That's from evolution. And so it's like, what is our mind constantly trying to do? Our mind's constantly trying to restore certainty, right? And so what does that mean? What is uncertainty? Uncertainty is not knowing, right? It's not knowing. And so when you step into the uncertainty of not knowing in any situation, you now have a choice, right? You can ask the right questions and solve the problem, or you can lie to yourself and create more cognitive dissonance, which is these contradicting thoughts, feelings, and ideas. And so why are you lying to yourself? To restore certainty instantly. It's like, I feel uncertain, I'm outside of my comfort zone, what do I do? Well, I lie to myself and tell me it's okay, or I believe something that's not true in order to restore certainty. So creativity is standing in the uncertainty of a problem and solving the problem. right? Staying there long enough to solve the problem. And then you expand your capacity for uncertainty. And that's creativity and that's growth. And so there's a couple ideas or concepts that can really change your life. The first one is ownership and responsibility. It's all your fault. If it's not your fault, then you don't have any power in it. And people get trapped on that. Well, why would I take responsibility for things if I don't know how to change it? That's true, because you're just causing yourself more suffering. So learn not only how to take responsibility, but why you should. And that's in our book. The second one is a growth versus fixed mindset. Carol Dweck's book is really profound in that area. Just read that book. And the other one is we look at is your level of internal safety. And it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You can only take risk if you have the capacity to do so based on your current understanding of how safe you are, secure you feel in the world. And so those are three principles that I really want my kids to walk away with, is a sense of security around who they are, their capabilities, and, as it relates to the world. I want them to believe that anything's possible and have a growth mindset. And I want them to be able to look at a situation and take ownership in it.
And I think that's excellent advice. It's very similar to what we've done with our kids. And because of that, they're able to do wonderful in their lives. It's still, my kids are still teenagers, so we don't know exactly where they'll end up, but everything they've done so far is setting the trajectory to having a wonderful and great life and making choices and not just doing what other people say they should do. They've taken unconditional paths and they're okay with that. They're okay walking where others haven't walked. And so I think they will be set and ready to do what they want. Is there anything that we should have covered today about perception and about living a better life that we did not talk about?
So here's the only thing I would say is that there are people listening to the sound of my voice that may be considering suicide right now, who may feel like they're hopeless, who may feel like they're never going to make it. And what I want to tell those people is that you're never beyond hope. And here's why. It's because there's nothing wrong with you, right? And I tell people all the time, you've never made a bad decision. They're like, yeah, I've made a lot. And I'm like, no, you're not even capable of it, because it's like you've only ever made decisions with bad information. So what's the difference? Here's the difference, is that we all make decisions the same way. We all make decisions like we take all the available information and we make the best decision we can with the information that's available to us. And the reason why that's so important is because you need to understand it's not you. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just an information problem. You and I know that good information leads to good decisions, leads to good outcomes, period. That's just the way things work. Faulty information leads to faulty decisions, leads to faulty outcomes. And so what I would say to you is, if your life is not what you want it to be, it's not because you've done anything wrong. It's because you made the best decision you could with the information that's available to you. Life comes down to decisions, right? And information. It's an information problem. It's not a you problem. So what is the source of our information? And that's where perception and emotions come in. Look, there was no way in this hour I was ever going to be able to cover these topics in a way that you could ultimately apply them to your lives. But you'll never not hear what I said, so you're open to new information. So where do you get that information? And look, people are like, oh, you're just trying to sell the book. Call me, email me. I'll send you the book for free, because that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is transform people's lives, because when we sold our tech company, the only reason we started doing this is because we asked ourselves one fundamental question. Is this the world that we want our children to grow up in? And if the answer was no, then if I have the means, then I have the responsibility to do something. And so we spent a lot of time putting all the information you need to know in our book, in our movie, and all of our other products and services. We have an assessment that will tell you everything, all of your false limiting beliefs. And so if you are stuck, do not fly blind. Don't try to figure it out yourself. You're wasting your time. Check out the book. The movie's screening for free on our website right now, and buy the book. Get the information you need to change your life.
And that's great advice. And I was going to ask you for one. So I'm going to ask you for an action step people can take this week, beyond just getting the book? What's one thing that they can do in their life that's easy and quick that at least starts them down this process?
Stop saying things that make you weak.
And sometimes I don't think we even realize we say them.
And so that's the awareness, right?
It is. And so ask somebody in your life to say, every time I say something weak, let me know. And think about it as you're talking. Ask yourself, was that a comment that came from strength, or was that a comment that came from weakness? And
correct.
We just have to fix our thoughts and get rid of the negativity and the weakness that prevents that.
Exactly.
It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Boy, that's a tough one. There's so many. So my secret is understanding the fundamentals that dictate and create your experience, which are a full understanding of how perception and emotions work.
And I think you've done a wonderful job today of explaining that to us. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
That there was no need to prove myself. That everything that I am is based on what I believe about myself, not what others think about me.
So true. And I always like the saying, I am enough. So wherever you are enough. And you got to accept that. If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
Realize that you're wrong.
For an 18-year-old, that's hilarious. Right?
So it's this one thing.
No, but that's true, because most 18-year-olds are like that, right? They think they know it all.
Question everything, every thought, every interpretation, every feeling, every idea, every concept. Learn how to question everything.
And teenagers are good at that, aren't they?
Yeah, but they're not questioning themselves. That's the part they missed, right?
There is that.
Inside and outside of you. Yeah.
Both places. If people would like to learn more, find you, connect, what is the best way for them to do that?
The best way for them to do that would be come to our website, which is powerful-u.com. You can get our book there. You can watch our movie there. Like I said, it's on for free right now. You can take our assessment, which is called Perception Sketch, but it's powerful-u.com.
And I will put that in the show notes to make it easy for everyone to find you. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom.
Hey, thank you so much, Rocky. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I actually would like the recording of this because I think it was one of the best shows I've ever done. So I really enjoyed it.
We will work on that for you. Thank you.
That's great. Have a great day.
That was a powerful conversation. What are you going to do differently? I'm making massive changes in my life. One of them is to get super focused on my calendar and focusing my time. I'm also going to watch my words. What am I saying and feeling? And asking myself, why? I enjoyed watching the movie and the book. From James. How are you with making decisions? What decisions do you not want to make? That's the one you need to make. First, make sure you gather the information and then ask yourself, is this true? How do I know that? This week's action step was to stop saying things that make you weak. That means you really need to watch your words. It's not easy to do that. But after you speak, think about what was the tone. Was it inspiring or was it weak? We're not going to go from A to B like James said. We're going to go from A to not A. So, what's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to build the life you deserve? Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. I can help you achieve your goals through coaching and accountability. Just email me or use the scheduling link in the show notes, and we can start with a short chat to see if we're a good fit for coaching. For many people, one session allows them to take a giant leap forward towards their dreams. You can also start connecting with me on the Facebook page and the Facebook group for Richer Soul. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.